Would the U.S. go to war with Venezuela over humanitarian aid? Millions need food and medicine, but are Donald Trump's threats of military action the answer? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is humanitarian aid for Venezuela. Well, Donald Trump may not recognize Nicolas Maduro as Venezuela's president, but the Venezuelan military still does. It continues to enforce a blockade at the border with Colombia, keeping out supplies that the opposition has been accumulating for thousands of people. And even though those aid parcels are meant to symbolize that Maduro has lost control of the economy, he still controls the military, and with that, the state. And Trump knows this. So he's turned his attention from simply attacking Maduro's legitimacy to threatening military action. In a stark warning announced to a crowd of supporters in Miami, Trump told the Venezuelan army that loyalty to Maduro would cost them everything. But is such a threat helpful to the opposition? Manuel Rueda is with them on the border with Colombia. He has this report.
Across Venezuela, thousands of people have been staging demonstrations to demand humanitarian aid be allowed into the country. But President Nicolas Maduro objects to international aid shipments, saying that instead the world should help the Venezuelan government to import its own supplies. As shortages of food and medicine become more severe, many are pressuring Maduro to change his mind. And now, a showdown over aid seems inevitable. With the help of the United States, Venezuela's opposition has gathered several tons of food and medicine and stored them at this warehouse just across the border from Venezuela. Juan Guaidó, the president of Venezuela's Congress, has pledged to move these supplies into the country.
On February 23rd, we will take humanitarian aid into Venezuela. Starting today, we will mobilize transport workers, nurses, and doctors to make this a reality.
Maduro has described the opposition's aid stockpile as part of an attempt to topple his socialist government. He's blocked a border bridge with trucks and containers to prevent aid shipments from coming in. Though the bridge has actually never been open to commerce, it was one of the places the opposition had picked to bring supplies into the country.
¿Alguien puede creer el cuento que Donald Trump quiere mucho a Venezuela? ¿Qué es lo que quiere Donald Trump de Venezuela? El petróleo, el oro, las riquezas de Venezuela.
The government and its supporters acknowledge that shortages of essential goods exist in Venezuela, but they argue these problems have been caused by economic sanctions that make it harder to import goods.
Venezuela doesn't need any handouts. If the economic blockade didn't exist, Venezuela could buy and import all the products it needs.
The opposition blames the shortages on years of mismanagement that have led to hyperinflation and depleted government income.
Maduro wants Venezuelan people to go hungry so that he can enslave them and blackmail them through hunger. That is why we are mobilizing this aid that includes many basic foods. 62% of our country lives in extreme poverty. 90% only eat twice a day.
The push to bring aid into Venezuela is also part of a power struggle. Guaidó argues that Maduro was re-elected in a sham vote last year and is trying to convince the military to support his plans to form a transitional government. But most of the military still stands behind Maduro. As the opposition tries to move aid into Venezuela, troops stationed along the borders will have to decide if they obey Maduro's orders or if they side with Guaidó and allow much-needed supplies into the country. Meanwhile, thousands of Venezuelans continue to leave their country to escape the economic crisis. Those who are left are pleading for help wherever it comes from, including patients in this dialysis clinic.
We need more medicines, and yes, we also need food. The truth is, we're going hungry, and if illnesses don't kill us, we will die of hunger.
Humanitarian aid has become a controversial issue in Venezuela. For the opposition, these supplies are meant to bring relief to thousands of people. For the Venezuelan government, they're part of an effort to undermine Maduro's presidency. Manuel Rueda, The Newsmakers, Cúcuta, Colombia.
Let's go to our guests now. And from Geneva, we have the first UN rapporteur to visit Venezuela since the 1990s, Alfred de Zayas. From Toronto, Canada, Alessandra Polga, who is a spokesperson for the opposition party Vente Venezuela. And completing our panel is Tomaso de la Longa. He is the spokesman for the president of the International Red Cross and Red Crescent. Thanks all three so much for joining us. Alfred, I'll begin with you in Geneva. First, we know that aid has become a political issue in Venezuela. However, President Maduro really does consider aid from the United States as a weapon of war of sorts. Is this aid, do you think, part of some kind of U.S. strategy to manipulate the situation in Venezuela, or is Maduro using aid, as the opposition has claimed, to blackmail his own people?
When I was in Venezuela in November, December 2017, I had the opportunity of speaking with members of the National Assembly, Fede Cámaras, non-governmental organizations like Provea that are very critical of the government. I also spoke with a dozen ministers and, of course, with the Minister of Foreign Affairs. One of the points that I always made is that it is important to solve the scarcity in food and medicines as fast as possible. I convened all of the UN agencies to a meeting in which we discussed how to give advisory services and technical assistance to the government, which has been given and is being given today. All ministers,
everyone agrees that the aid is needed.
No, it's important for me to clarify that the government, of course, wants to accept humanitarian aid. Of course, all the ministers welcome humanitarian aid. They have just received last week 933 tons of humanitarian aid from China, from India, from Bolivia, from Cuba, from Turkey, etc. And just a couple of days ago, 300 tons of aid came in by plane from Russia. So they are perfectly welcoming this kind of aid. But the United States has conducted, and this is well documented in my report to the UN Human Rights Council, has conducted an economic war against Venezuela and imposed sanctions that are a major, and I repeat, a major cause of the economic crisis that the people are suffering. So what is quite clear to me is that a tormentor, a torturer, cannot just simply mutate into a good Samaritan. It is unacceptable for the United States to freeze $30 billion worth of assets of the government of Venezuela and then to offer $20 million so that they can appear like the good guys. Now, this is such bad faith that I can thoroughly understand why Maduro is not willing to accept aid from the United States. Maduro will accept aid from Switzerland, will accept aid from the United Nations, from the Red Cross, from whomever, but not from the one country that has the most responsibility in creating this crisis.
Okay, understood. Alessandra, I just have to ask if you're on the same page.
Absolutely not.
And tell us why.
Well, I'm a regular Venezuelan citizen, forced to live in the exile. We have a non-profit organization. We work specifically with the victims from the public demonstration in Venezuela on 2017. Most of them are shoot down, and they have been wounded from the government repression. They are paralyzed, and it's something that I have to be in touch every day directly with the people of Venezuela. I'm the one on charge to bring the resources for food, medical treatment, surgeries, and that kind of thing. I still have relatives in Venezuela, friends in Venezuela, and we be in touch daily, permanently.
Okay. But let me ask you this question, though, more pointedly. Do you accept that the United States providing aid for Venezuela isn't so much about a humanitarian interest there? It is part of a political strategy on behalf of the U.S. to, as the government and others say, outside the country as well, as a strategy to interfere in Venezuela's politics and change the political landscape of Venezuela. Now, you may think that the United States wants to change it for the better, and that's fine, that's your opinion, but do you agree at least that the United States is involved in this aid scheme for reasons other than humanitarian assistance?
No, I don't think so, because it's not only United States who is involved in give humanitarian aid to Venezuela. There are involved different organizations, not just from the United States. Is the government of Colombia, is the government of Brazil, is a few governments in the hemisphere that are helping and supporting the crisis in Venezuela. Because
okay, but let's focus on U.S. aid, because that is what's at stake right now. It's President Trump making threats against Venezuela and the accusations that the United States specifically is using the aid they're sending as a tool. Do you agree that the United States... No. So the United States has purely humanitarian interest in Venezuela?
No. Yes, in this case, yes.
And I mean, do you accept, though, that the United States has a somewhat poor record in Latin America, as it has the history in Chile, for example, Nicaragua, Guatemala, before? Do you feel that this time the U.S. agenda is different?
The actions are different. The situation in Venezuela is not, there is not precedent in Latin America. It's the first time that the situation that we have right now in Venezuela is a group of conditions that make what's happened right now in Venezuela. And we receive support even for Canada. I live in Canada, and I work with the government of Canada, and we receive 53 million of humanitarian aid from Canada. I think that we receive donation from the European Parliament. We are not talking just United States.
Okay.
We are talking. Let me finish, please. We are talking about human beings. This is not ideology. This is not the one country want to interfere in Venezuela's affair. It's just try to save people who is dying for starvation and lack of medicine.
Okay. Tommaso, I promise to get to you in a second, but I just need to get Alfred's response to that. Alfred, you're hearing from a Venezuelan citizen that there is no precedent for this, that this situation in Venezuela is unique, and that the United States has the interest of the Venezuelan people at heart.
That's a bit ridiculous. It's like the U.S. having had an interest in the welfare of the Nicaraguans at the time that illegally the United States was using U.S. aid, using the humanitarian pretext to fund and to arm the Contras in the 1980s in Nicaragua. The United States wants regime change, and it's using every possible trick in the book to arrive there. Now, when I went to Venezuela, and by the way, when I was a student at Harvard University, I was a member of the Republican Club. I'm still a member of the Republican Party in the United States. But I reject this kind of interventionism and I am closer to the approach of President Jimmy Carter, whom I know personally, and I am very concerned that Trump is running himself into, a cul-de-sac, and he's going to lose face unless he actually uses military force to get that so-called humanitarian aid into Venezuela. But I have, when I spoke last with the Venezuelan ambassador here in Geneva, because he has contacted me several times since I was the only rapporteur who ever went to Venezuela.
Okay.
So I have told Valero, for Christ's sake, have the International Committee of the Red Cross distribute any and all humanitarian aid that is offered, whether it's offered by the United States or by anybody else, as long as there's no contraband, as long as there's no abuse and not misuse. As I said, there's a weaponization of human rights, and there's also a weaponization of humanitarian aid.
Let me put that to Tommaso, because let's talk now. Tommaso, I know you don't want to have to comment on the politics so much of the situation here. So let's talk about the actual humanitarian need. And Alfred does suggest something interesting. If the United States does have only the humanitarian interest at heart here, as well as all the other political players involved internationally, why aren't they giving this to the Red Cross, a neutral third party, to distribute all the aid that can be collected to the people in need in Venezuela?
Look, actually, as you said correctly, we will not enter in any political discussion. I was in Venezuela a few days ago, last week, and I saw a very difficult and complex situation where needs are growing and sufferance of people is growing. What we are saying in the last few weeks to all the parties and to all the parties involved without any distinction is that we are deeply concerned that the humanitarian aid has been used as a political tool, and we really would like to see humanitarian, all the political parties to step back and to be sure that humanitarian aid is again neutral, guided only by neutrality, impartiality, and independence. And is what we are saying to all the parties involved in Venezuela at the moment. As Red Cross, obviously, we are ready to do our work. We said it all the time. And actually, by the way, I have to underline that we are in country since many years, and through our national society, the Venezuelan Red Cross, who is running also hospitals and health facilities, but who is also affected itself by this crisis. So again, needs are there. We saw people suffering, we saw lack of medicine, we saw problems in the health system, we saw problem of lack of food. So our main concern at the moment is how to better serve people in need. And the first thing is that we need to have the right condition to operate on the field, and the right condition must be only having a neutral, impartial, independent way of operating on the field. Only to give you an example, in every part of the world, the Red Cross is dealing with all the parties on the ground, even in extreme situations like a war zone, for instance. But then one of the first things that we want to respect is that the assessment on the ground on the needs of people are made by us, so are compiled by us.
Right.
And second is that all the humanitarian aid must respect our international standards, because we cannot risk any issue and any problem if we're not involved since the beginning in this humanitarian aid delivery.
Okay, Tommaso, I'm going to ask you this. If you can't answer it, I will understand. I'm wondering if you, as an impartial observer here, can give us some kind of historical context, because yes, the Venezuelan economy is struggling, but even while GDP was growing in Venezuela in the past, the poverty was absolutely crushing. There were many, many desperately poor people, and hungry people for that matter, in Venezuela. That was never considered an issue of international concern. Now it is, because of this massive economic crisis. But if you can tell us, is it much worse now, comparatively, to what the crushing poverty was before? The supporters of Maduro and Chavez say they were given the benefits of their socialist revolution and their lives were improved over the last decade and a half or so.
Look, first of all, unfortunately, at the moment, every single figure, every single data, even the wording in this kind of situation in Venezuela has been used from both sides and manipulated. So this is why we are not entering in this kind of discussion. I can say that in the last year, I mean, our programs and our activities were, I mean, with the program that we are running now, which, I mean, has not started in the last few weeks, but has started in the last years. Only last year in our hospitals and outpatient clinics, and through our local-based activities in communities, we reach almost 1 million Venezuelans. So again, it's not only, the point is not who is, I mean, who is bad, who is good, or where is the point, and where is, I mean, the starting point. The point is that at the moment on the ground there are needs, and we need to serve these people in need. We cannot leave them alone.
But I mean, okay, Alessandra and Alfred, I will give this question to both of you to discuss, because Donald Trump says that what is happening now in Venezuela is a failure of socialism. But if millions of people in Venezuela feel their lives have improved because of that same socialism, even while overall GDP may be dropping, is it really a failure? Alfred, let me begin with you.
Well, let me say that I am neither a Marxist, nor a communist, nor a socialist. I am a member of the Republican Party in the United States, and I am a believer in the free market. But I'm also a believer in respecting other people's opinions. And if the Venezuelan people, by a landslide, elected Chavez several times, and Maduro, in any event with a small majority, it is their good right. As early as the 16th century, Francisco de Vitoria said that every nation had the right to choose its government, even if it was not the best one.
Right.
And the most important here to understand is there is a crisis, an economic crisis, but this economic crisis has been caused primarily by the financial blockade, by the sanctions, by the economic war, not unlike the economic war against Salvador Allende in 1970-73, which ended with the toppling of Allende, his death, and 17
Alfred,
years of Augusto Pinochet.
I need to give Alessandra final words. Alessandra, go ahead.
Well, I don't want to go with this is a problem of left or right. We have a campaign in Canada that said, ask a Venezuelan. As a Venezuelan, I just can speak in terms that with 1 million of inflation, when the average Venezuelan just earned $4 per month, and you had to pay $8 for a dozen of eggs to feed an entire family, we are not talking about the failure of political ideologies. We are talking about the failure in economic measure and how this previous government work with the administration of the resource in Venezuela.
Okay. Alessandra, I'm so unfortunately going to have to interrupt you. We are completely out of time for this segment. But I'd like to thank all three of you so much for joining us. I'm sorry we didn't have more time to give each of you, but thanks again. Still to come on The Newsmakers, a new plan to return Rohingya refugees to Myanmar. We discuss the possibility of a safe zone in Rakhine State. And NASA pulls the plug on the Mars rover Opportunity. I speak to an astrophysicist on what we've learned and what's next for space exploration. Well, Bangladesh's foreign minister wants Russia, China, and India to help establish a safe zone for Rohingya refugees inside Myanmar. More than 750,000 Rohingya Muslims fled Myanmar to Bangladesh, creating the world's fastest growing refugee crisis. Bangladesh says a safe zone would encourage the Rohingya to return home, but many have been unwilling to do so for more than a year for fear of persecution. The UN accuses Myanmar's military of ethnic cleansing and genocide, something the government firmly denies. Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined now from Yangon by Nyo On Mint, who is the director of Myanmar's Center for Peace and Reconciliation. He's also a former spokesman for the state councillor Aung San Suu Kyi. From London, we have Sultan Mahmoud Sharif. He is the president of the UK chapter of Bangladesh's ruling party, the Awami League. And with me here in the studio is Azim Ibrahim. He is the author of The Rohingyas Inside Myanmar's Genocide. Thanks all so much for joining us. Let me begin in the studio then with Azim. We know Bangladesh does not want Rohingya refugees to get too comfortable, let's put it that way, on Bangladeshi soil, and as time passes, their fear is that's what's essentially going to happen. But since they are not safe returning home to Myanmar, is a safe zone the best middle ground?
Well, this idea of the safe zone is quite a recent idea. I think has been proposed by Myanmar as another mechanism simply to buy time. We have been in this situation before. This is not the first exodus that we have seen. The Rohingya come over the border from Myanmar. This has happened multiple times before. You know, it's happened in the 80s. It happened a number of times in the 1990s and in the 2000s as well. So, and each time Myanmar proposes these kinds of solutions of safe zones, of repatriation, of various kind of mechanisms. And in each time we realise that it's simply just a mechanism to buy time until world attention moves on and those refugees become a permanent feature in Bangladesh. And I believe that is what the intention is at the moment, is simply to buy time.
Nyo On Mint, is it that insincere, the idea of a safe zone?
Yeah, I don't think that's going to be the real sustainable solution because you know that the previously a lot of accusations, a lot of the complaints, but the presently there's going to be it's quite a bit safe. Then a lot of international tensions, and then the government of Myanmar is willing to set the international standard. So I don't think that that's going to be a problem for the Rohingya refugee. In other words, it's going to be not only that the process, it's another like a refugee camp in Myanmar. But what about like almost 1,500,000 who's still in Myanmar in that area? It's I never heard that that's going to be a very danger for them. And then that's going to be another problem is that the international community should look at the safety for all, because the last couple months ago, there's going to be the almost half a dozen the Rakhine community, Rakhine women, and then other farmers were being killed. So that's going to be it should say that safety for all. I think it's better.
Okay, let me turn to Sultan Mahmoud Sharif. I mean, Dhaka, as we said, is seeking international backing as well for the establishment of this safe zone. How confident are you that it could actually work, given especially Azim's feeling that it is just a time-buying mechanism on behalf of the Myanmar government, who has no intention of actually returning any Rohingyas safely to the country?
Bangladesh's role is known to everybody. These people who are in trouble were driven out of their own land, and we used all our resources, all our abilities to see that they are safe inside Bangladesh territory in that situation. We have asked for international help. We have asked for all the countries of the world to support our attempt to send them back to their home, actual home and heart. That is our primary position. We want them to go back to their own land, live there peacefully as proper citizen of that country with all the human rights and rights available for any citizen. Myanmar has up till now failed to do that, and they must do that for the sake of the universal acceptance of these people in their country with all their physical and otherwise rights. The torture and humiliation they have gone through over years and years must be ended as soon as possible.
Okay. I mean, you can hear, Azim, in a sense, the desperation of Bangladesh, even if they understand to an extent that it may be some time before it's anywhere near safe enough for refugees to be returned. They want it done quickly. So is there a way, if a safe zone cannot be ensured, obviously, by Myanmar, are there outside forces? Is there an international coalition, maybe just even basic security from the UN, that could negotiate with Myanmar to establish a firm territory inside Myanmar's borders to get this done?
Yeah. The difficulty with that is that if you speak to any of the Rohingya refugees, none of them are actually willing to go back. You know, I spent a considerable amount of time in the camps, and I actually interviewed some of the Rohingya that were literally coming over the border, that came over fresh off the boat, and I asked all of them whether they're willing to go back. All of them said yes, but only if they're given equal rights and citizenship. And this is being denied. So the solution for Myanmar is relatively quite simple. It's take back the Rohingya, who are citizens of that land, and give them full citizenship and equal rights. And this is just another mechanism to prevaricate. I fully understand Bangladesh's situation. You know, they are having to foot the bill for this very unfairly. But I also believe that this strategy is flawed. They should be pursuing legal action against Myanmar for this exodus and pursuing Myanmar for financial compensation to host those refugees, to host their citizens in their country.
Yeah, but legal action could take years and years. And Myanmar, let's be honest, it hasn't minded, especially under the military dictatorship, it hasn't minded being a pariah state in the past. Why would it listen to international legal action that might rule against it? It will continue to fight. It sounds in theory as a perfect idea, but realistically, it would take far too long. And again, we'd have the Rohingya refugees making themselves more and more a part of the Bangladeshi territorial fabric.
Yeah, and it's also equally unrealistic to assume that Myanmar is a sincere party in this endeavour. They have spent half a century trying to get rid of the Rohingya. As soon as they drove the Rohingya out, you know, they ensured that all the Rohingya villages were burnt to the ground, were bulldozed. The land has already been redistributed to local Rakhines. So they have changed the facts on the ground. They mined the border so none of the Rohingya could actually come back. You know, so they have spent quite a considerable amount of time and effort to ensure that their land is completely free of the Rohingya. So they're not a sincere party in these negotiations.
So is that the best solution, though, that you can think of right now, is Bangladesh should try and pursue the legal channels available?
Unfortunately, that is the most realistic solution, is for Bangladesh to aggressively pursue Myanmar in the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice for compensation. You know, Bangladesh just put out an announcement for $920 million to provide for these refugees, which is an astronomical sum. You know, and they have to do this on a regular kind of basis. And there's absolutely no reason why Bangladesh should have to carry this burden alone.
Okay. And your own mint, how would Myanmar potentially respond to that? If Bangladesh starts looking to take legal channels instead of continuing to engage in these negotiations that are fruitless so far, what would Myanmar's response be?
Yeah, that's a very unfortunate situation. And then, but I don't think the government would accept that the challenges. And then we also have like a proof of that the situation. That's all the politicizing and then situation. Because my question is why that the other 500,000 Rohingyas are still live in Myanmar and then very safe. And what is that another solution? Because maybe we're going to find that the political situation, because the human rights violation, I don't see that there was any human rights violations. I'm only worried about that the armed militant, both the Rakhine and then the Rohingya, the militants are killing on that situation. We should have like a rule of law at the first place to live to the refugees to come back to the Myanmar, and then that's for sure that international should participate, and then also Myanmar government should allow that some kind of international standard. The other than that they're going to, if like Bangladeshi government, if they prefer to have it like seeking that the financial the compensation, that's going to be, I think that we should see at the court, international court.
Okay, then let me ask Sultan, would you agree that Bangladesh should perhaps be looking at the legal channels available to try and move this forward?
Bangladesh wants Myanmar to take their people back. The Myanmar's rulers, if they thought they are out of another zone of not this world, they are stupid and foolish. They will be compelled to do that if only our neighboring countries put maximum effort and the international community is behind us, that Myanmar knows. Dictatorial regimes are always like this. They have to be compelled by everybody together to feel that it is their people and they are not owners. Those people are the owners of that land. Those people who have been thrown out of their country are equal citizens like the military generals and the thugs who have killed these people, who have destroyed their lives, who have made them homeless, who have done so much mischief and so much offense to these people. It is inhuman. It cannot be accepted by any country, anybody in the world. So I urge upon all the people of the world to come and stand by those people and support them to go back to their country, and those thugs who try to stop them, they should be eliminated from this process.
Okay. I'm not so sure then about Bangladesh's interest really in pursuing the legal channels. It's not obviously not that clear from the answer we got there, and of course it's something that will have to be considered at length. But let me move on to something else, because Myanmar's position here adds another layer of complexity to all of this, and that, as Nyon Min said, they are looking for safety for all of Rakhine's people. And they argue that within the Rohingya Muslim refugee community, there are criminal elements, there are extremist elements that threaten the safety of other people in Rakhine State. So, how should that be addressed? First of all, do you think it's a legitimate position to take? And how can that be worked out to say to the Myanmar government that this is a safe and innocent population of people that deserves to have their homes back, and they are of no threat to Myanmar's security?
Mr. Mint is referring to the Arsa attacks that resulted in a few security forces being killed. The result of that was Myanmar's military driving out, 750,000 people within one of the quickest exoduses in modern times. I don't believe anybody thinks that this is a proportionate response. If there are criminal elements, you need police action against those criminal elements. But what we have here, what I take issue with your other guest, is that he said there's been no reports of human rights violations. Independent fact-finding mission from the United Nations and multiple other bodies have now classified this as officially as a genocide. This is a genocide on a scale we've not seen since Rwanda. So this idea that there's been no human rights violation is patently false, and to draw this moral equivalence between the Rakhines and the Rohingya as victims is also the equivalent of saying, both the Nazis and the Jews were equally to blame for the Holocaust. One is clearly the victim here, and the other one is clearly the persecutor. This has been documented very, very extensively, and to draw this kind of equivalence is just moral bankruptcy.
Nyon Mint, I'll give you a chance to respond.
I think there's going to be a lot of accusation, but I'm really the concern about that some sexual abuses and stuff like that. It should have after almost a year, there's going to be some kind of the Afghans of the Myanmar people, or that's going to be a lot of accusation. I'm really afraid that the victim is at the Rohingya, as well as the Rakhine people, as well as everybody's got suffering on this conflict. So, because the conflict started from the Arsa.
Okay, I'm going to finish with this. We're really down to our last minute. I'm sorry, Azim, I'm going to bring it back to the studio because the bottom line here is if something isn't done soon, how much does the risk of radicalization, the formation of even criminal gangs, as does happen, and the general degradation of the community of Rohingya increase? And then we all have a massive problem.
Absolutely, and this is inevitable. You have literally 1.2 million people in the largest refugee camp in the world who don't have access to proper healthcare or education, any long-term kind of sustainability efforts. So it's just a question of time, I believe, before this population will become radicalized. I think anybody placed in that situation will become radicalized. You know, if you are of the belief that you're going to die in this refugee camp, and after you are dead, your children are going to die in this refugee camp as beggars, we'll all become radicalized in this situation. That is why the international community needs to pursue this much more aggressively and hold Myanmar to account for creating this crisis in the first place. This is a completely manufactured crisis by the Myanmar authorities and the Myanmar military. And the interesting thing is that now they have finished with the Rohingya. The Myanmar military is turning its attention to other minorities they are pursuing in the same fashion. The Shan, the Kachin, the Karen are now also facing the same treatment as the Rohingyas. If you allow one genocide to happen, you're opening the doors to many others.
Okay, Azim, unfortunately, I'm going to have to give you the final word because we are completely out of time for this segment. But I'd like to thank all three of our guests sincerely so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. Well, the U.S. government is giving NASA a boost, and we're not talking about rockets here. The space agency is getting an extra $1.5 billion added to its budget, and it couldn't come at a better time. NASA just pulled the plug on its Mars space rover called Opportunity after the vehicle stopped communicating with Earth last June. Now the question for the agency is, what's the next step in space exploration? We'll have that conversation in a moment, but first, here's a look back at Opportunity's groundbreaking work.
4, 3, 2, main engine start, 0, and liftoff of the Delta rocket with Opportunity.
We're seeing it on the LCP.
You are my sweetheart, baby, in every way. You are the one that I will always adore. Say you'll be mine forevermore.
You know, this was a 90-day mission, and we were so excited by just having 3 months to explore the planet with just a kilometer of capability. But 14 and a half years later and 45 kilometers of odometry, we've done phenomenal things. We've greatly expanded our understanding of the red planet.
What we were able to do was true geologic exploration on the surface of another planet for the first time.
What the rovers have told us about Mars is that at one time Mars was much like the Earth, that it had warmer temperatures, it had a thicker atmosphere, and there was sustained liquid water on the surface.
And we tried valiantly over these last 8 months to try to recover the rover, to get some signal from it. And we sent over 1,000 recovery commands, trying to exercise every possibility of getting a signal from the rover.
Rover made our world a bigger place, and that's, I think, one of its great legacies.
We said we're going to operate this vehicle until the day where we can't, and that's exactly what we did, and I'm really proud.
Well, let's welcome back to the program retired astrophysicist and astronomy instructor Laird Whitehill. Thanks so much for joining us again. The end here, we just heard them say they've made our world a better place. You've watched the work of these rovers over the many years that they've been active. What did they give you? What did you most value from what those rovers collected?
You know, it's a very emotional answer to a question like that, because the rovers were, more than anything, an emotional experience for me and for so many others. The science that they did was important and part of an ongoing question about life and on Mars and elsewhere. So the answers they came up with about life, about water, was only part of what got me excited. The part that got me excited was the adventure, the things that human beings were able to do on Earth to fix the problems that occurred on Mars. There were opportunities spent almost 15 years on the surface of the planet, and almost from the very beginning, it had problems. One of the most spectacular problems, for example, was the fact that a heater malfunctioned very early on. And the way they decided to fix it was to turn the whole spacecraft off at night so that the heater wouldn't run all the time.
Right.
And in the end, when the dust storm finally wiped out the spacecraft, that heater probably ran all night and drained the batteries. So the thing that caused the problem 15 years before probably killed the spacecraft 15 years later.
It's amazing.
It was solving problems like that.
Right.
But finally, yes.
You mentioned, though, you mentioned water and how it almost felt emotional to you that
Yes.
data came back. And, you know, it often happens that data gathered by these kinds of machines and these space missions, it actually just goes over the public's head. But what was so remarkable about this mission is that it came down to something simple but remarkable, finding water on Mars.
Not only did they find water, which they expected to find, and they found again and again, they found the kind of water they were looking for. Mostly for the first part of the mission, the Opportunity mission, they found water that was acidic and was basically sulfuric acid water. And they kept finding that kind of water again and again, and that's not conducive for life at all.
That's interesting.
But 11 years into a 90-day mission, they found drinkable water that had been on the surface of Mars.
Let me ask you this. There had been a lot of talk. We'll talk about the future of the organization now and space exploration. There had been a lot of talk about how NASA had, in a sense, kind of passed its glory days. You know, that the costs had become too prohibitive since reaching the heights of putting a man on the moon, for example, and launching these very high-profile manned missions before. But do you think, at this point now, space exploration can get back the high profile it had and eventually merit even more investment so that space exploration can move forward into the next generation?
Yeah, I think the United States has picked up speed in that regard. I think they let the ball drop for a decade or more. I think they have some grand plans to get back in the game, and their plans, in my opinion, are not grand enough, but I'm sure that we can pick up speed given our past history of having gotten to the moon first. We can do it anytime we set our minds to it. Just put enough money behind it and we're there. We have the capability to get there before the Chinese if we want to. And we may, in fact, do that. We may not. You know, it depends upon what the money allocated in the years to come.
Right. Thousands on top of thousands of images were sent back by the Mars rover. I have to ask you, did you have a favorite image, something you saw that actually just caught you by surprise? Go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, well, there were quite a few, but my very favorites are of this picture taken at the edge of a crater called Victoria Crater, and pictures of a particular cliff escarpment called Cape Verde. Gives you a real sense of what it was like to be on Mars in that place and actually they entered the crater at Cape Verde. So it's one of the most spectacular places they've ever been on Mars.
Okay, Laird Whitehill. Yeah. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, we'll speak to the man who saved millions of lives in India by preventing an AIDS catastrophe. Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.